Hello, welcome to the Pediatric Brain Tumors webinar, Why the States Matter, Advocacy Work in Your Backyard. My name is Jen Kelly, and I'm the Family Support Manager for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for this important subject. Before we get started, I have a few guidelines to review. You're muted for this webinar and your video is disabled, but we do welcome questions during and after the opening remarks. Please type your questions into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will not get to every question, but we will get to as many as possible. We're pleased to welcome Michael Henry and Dr. Chrissy Salley. Michael Henry is the Director of Advocacy for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation. He's the father of Eternal Star Blair, who passed away in 2020 from a rare embryonal tumor. His past work includes working with political, religious, and higher education nonprofits on policy and fundraising initiatives. Dr. Chrissy Salley is a pediatric psychologist in New York City, specializing in children, adolescents, young adults, and their families. She is currently the Director of Clinician Engagement and Outreach at the Courageous Parents Network, a nonprofit organization devoted to supporting families caring for children with serious health conditions. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael Henry and Dr. Christina Salley.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm going to start off and then we'll roll into Dr. Salley's presentation. But first, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. This is really important work, and I know it's really important to all of us. I just want to recognize the urgency that a lot of us feel around wanting to do more and wanting to help our children and help each other in this community. So I'm just so glad that everyone could be here today. This initiative is just one of the ways that PBTF is offering folks a way to change the landscape for children battling cancer. And we welcome you as part of our efforts moving forward. So first, what is a cancer plan? Just to set its origins, the National Comprehensive Cancer Control Program was established in 1998 by the CDC, and their goal was to bring together coalitions within each state to tackle cancer patients' challenges. The CDC provides funding to states for the creation of each state's cancer plan, and each state kind of tackles the drafting of their plan a little differently, and the structure of their drafting body a little differently. But it almost always involves some kind of coalition of representatives from the state health department and clinicians or other stakeholders from the cancer community. So why is this plan even important? The plans really set goals for the entire state, but more specifically, the health department. So over the 5 years of the plan, state stakeholders will commit time, effort, and funding to accomplish those goals. And these plans really become the de facto cancer agenda for the state, which means the policyholders look to these plans when trying to understand how to tackle healthcare issues involving the cancer community. And these plans can really set the stage for legislative action once they're submitted and published. But here's the problem. The big problem is a lack of pediatric representation on many of these drafting boards. This is kind of an example of the larger problem in the entire cancer space, but it's a relative, because of our relatively small patient pool, children's voices and pediatric voices can be overlooked. Again, a great illustration of the larger problem. Yeah, our patient pool is smaller, but it's also the #1 disease killer for children. And those that survive a childhood cancer diagnosis also suffer from long-term complications that really deserve recognition and priority within these plans. So a lack of pediatric representation means that goals and objectives specific to childhood cancers are few and far between. And that's what we see across the country with these plans, is a lack of pediatric specific goals and objectives and language. If we could move to the next slide. That leads us to why we've chosen to tackle this issue through our state cancer plan initiative. In starting this initiative, we have a few goals. The first is to build working groups within each state that include diverse voices from the pediatric cancer community. We welcome people who can offer their expertise no matter the field. And once we've established a working group and we've connected with the state's drafting board, our group will then work to help them understand the unique challenges facing kids and families and clinicians and researchers battling cancer in their state. This is a long process, depending on the timeline of the drafting body and where your plan is in its cycle. Some of the boards that we're working with are looking to submit their plans next year, at the end of this year. Some are looking to submit it at the end of the following year. So it really depends on the timeline of the drafting board, where in this process we can jump in and help them understand and draft these pieces. Ultimately, our team is looking to ensure that the concrete pediatric specific goals are included in the updated plans, and the recommendations that our group provide each drafting board will improve outcomes for the children diagnosed with cancer in their state. Move to the next slide, please. One of the important aspects for us in starting this initiative is that it will be locally driven. We're here to help organize and guide groups through the process, but the people driving this effort will be residents of the state. In order for the group to truly represent the entire state, we will be recruiting from all geographic regions. Where people live can play a huge role in the quality of care available to them. So we want to make sure that we are capturing the many experiences of state residents. There's a big difference between the healthcare afforded to rural residents and urban residents. So we want to make sure that those voices are all represented within the group. We also want to recruit voices from all major pediatric cancer treatment facilities in the state. Better coordination between these institutions is essential to combating childhood cancer. And if we can help strengthen the connection between children's hospitals and those hospitals in the state, then we think we can improve the consistency of care within each state. We can move to the next slide. So what are we looking for in our groups? I mentioned earlier that we are looking for diverse voices, and that really means finding advocates with a range of experiences with the disease. So survivors, family members, clinicians, mental health experts, the list goes on. All of these people bring something to the table. As you'll see with Dr. Salley's presentation, she offered her specific expertise in the mental health field and the psychosocial standards. So when we bring these folks together, we're really looking for them to offer up their experiences. Having a diverse group of voices contributing to this process really ensures that the recommendations are a comprehensive representation of the pediatric cancer experience in each state. Next slide. Here's a breakdown of our New York group, which just submitted its 6-page list of recommendations to the New York Cancer Consortium's steering committee. As you can see, we had representation from major institutions, local and national nonprofits. Memorial Sloan Kettering should actually be on there. We had almost the entire oncology team at Sloan Kettering involved in this group. We also had a range of family and survivor experiences. This group is truly incredible, and they're going to continue to do great work as they go through the drafting process alongside the steering committee. And of course, Dr. Salley is one of them. Move to the next slide, please. So here are some of the issues that the New York group tackled. This isn't comprehensive, but it gives you a good sense of the different issues that arose during the process of crafting these recommendations. I know Dr. Salley will be able to speak a little bit about how they came up with the psychosocial and mental health recommendations during their group discussions. But as you can see, and as you all know, childhood cancer is very complex. And there are so many issues that families have to deal with, both in the short term and the long term. And this is a great illustration of why it's important that childhood cancer be addressed in these plans. I know that some of you submitted questions and identified issues that you think are important to address within these plans. And a lot of them line up with the priorities of the New York group and what they identified as the real challenges facing them. It just means that these experiences are universal, and they're not limited to one region of the United States. Let's move to the next slide. So what happens after we submit our recommendations to the state? Hopefully the state has adopted some or all of them. It's important that our groups start thinking about how we can work with policymakers in the state to help achieve the goals set out in the plan. And that means monitoring legislation that could potentially help our community and lobbying on behalf of that legislation. It means meeting with legislators to propose and help craft new pieces of legislation that could tackle specific issues like research funding or educational needs. The working groups we establish really continue as coalitions that can recruit and build our local advocacy efforts. And we will continue to be active in the state working alongside each other to pressure change makers, just like we do on the federal level. I will talk a little bit more to you personally about how you can get involved. But first, I want to invite Dr. Salley to share her experience as a member of our New York State Working Group. Dr. Salley played an important role in the crafting of our recommendations and continues to serve as a subject matter specialist for the steering committee. I can't thank her enough for her leadership in our effort there. And Dr. Salley, why don't you take it away and talk about your experiences?
Thank you so much, Mike. I have a few slides myself I'm going to share here. So as Mike said, I am a resident of New York State and was really pleased to be invited to join this initiative under the leadership of Mike and PBTF. This is something that is incredibly important to be thinking about for all of the reasons that Mike outlined. And New York State is one of those states he mentioned that has had no representation of pediatrics in the cancer care plans in the past. Mike also mentioned the rate at which these the work is done on these plans, that some might be a process of 1 or 2 years, but New York is a case where the current cancer plan does expire at the end of 2023. And because of that, our work on this project has actually been quite rapid. So I'm going to describe a little bit about what my experience has been like as a subject matter specialist. As Mike described, I was invited to participate in my role as a pediatric psychologist who has psychosocial expertise, as I have done most of my clinical work and research in the population of children with cancer and their families. And so we started this process, I think we formalized in January of this year, so just 4 months ago, where the subject matter specialists gathered together under Mike's guidance. We were given a summary very similar to the one he just described for all of us here today on what this is, what it means, and how this operates, including some insights at the New York State specific level. And from that, we split off into 3 groups where we were going to meet with other stakeholders, in addition, under the guidance of some of the subject matter specialists, to get a sense as to what the lived experience is, and what priorities those residents of New York State might have for us to consider as we form our recommendations to deliver to the state. I was a co-leader of the survivorship subgroup with a survivor named Jacob, and he and I met with a group of survivors to talk about what their experiences were like while they were undergoing treatment and what their needs are since having completed treatment. I then also joined the patient and family subgroup for their meeting, given my background in working with patient and families. And as a psychologist and as a person who advocates for mental health support, not only for pediatric patients, but also their family members, including the parent caregiver, I felt I could make a contribution to that group. And what was a good thing is that there was quite a bit of overlap into the priority areas identified by the survivors and the patient family subgroup, which was good to start gathering consensus as we formulated our recommendations. We then all worked on drafting the recommendations separately, but also together via a shared document, which allowed for multiple contributors and dialogue in between our meetings. This was a really important tool to use given the pace at which we had to make our recommendations. It was just not feasible to do all of this via many, many meetings. And then a few weeks ago, we met as just a small group of subject matter specialists to finalize the language. The survivorship subgroup talked through many experiences and raised priorities that were based on their personal experiences and that of which they have heard from their peers who are also survivors. And they also raised concerns for their family members and recognizing the burden of pediatric cancer on their parents. I've bolded a few issues that really, I think, floated to the top for this group. We talked in detail about comprehensive survivorship plans and having plans that are customized to the individual, that summarize the treatments they've had, and also identify, based on what is known in the science, some potential expectations for long-term and late effects for that survivor that the survivor can then take to all of their medical providers as they continue along throughout their life. And they also named that a part of the issue of getting survivorship care is that many pediatric and adult physicians and subspecialties do not have expertise in the needs of children who and young adults who have been treated for cancer, and wanting to find ways to address that issue. There were topics of educational issues that were we really fleshed out a lot of the sub issues within that, like return to school, educational needs while on treatment, identifying learning issues, emotional issues, facilitating evaluation for that, the development, creation of IEPs that have actual practical recommendations that are useful to survivors and specific to pediatric cancer, and so on. We also identified endocrinology and reproductive health as subspecialty areas that were of particular concern and need. They spoke a lot about mental health needs for survivors and family members. And we also took note of the lack of statewide metrics. So in the state of New York, there are quite a few metrics that are documented that help demonstrate how the state is doing on the recommendations in the cancer care plan. And so currently, because there are no pediatric recommendations, there are also no pediatric metrics. And so we wanted to make a recommendation for that as well. The patient family subgroup identified, as I said, many overlapping themes, but also many unique themes. Of that, including financial concerns, financial burden to the family. We spoke extensively because one of our experts has experience in this on tissue sharing. We talked about equal access to care. Again, mental health came to the top, bereavement support, sibling support, and the issue of palliative care. So here in the state of New York, and I know this is the case in many other places, there is a lack of pediatric focused providers and community palliative care programs. And there is still issue of long-term palliative care access within pediatric treatment centers. So after we had these conversations, we went and put pen to paper or finger to keyboard and started drafting the recommendations. And one of the things that our group really relied on Mike for was thinking about the language for this and the way to organize the document in a way that was going to be received by the state. We had conversations over language such as what are we describing as aims versus goals versus strategies. Mike educated us on his, based on his conversation at the state level, that New York State was very interested in focusing on specific strategies to be implemented. So we had broad aims and goals, but really re-honed our language on the strategy component. We tried to craft active language. So as opposed to saying things like, survivors need access to mental health care, or parents of children, caregivers of children need access to mental health care, we would say something like engage pediatric treatment centers in the development of comprehensive behavioral health programs and so on. So we tried to create active language to be more specific about what the ask was. We had a lot of conversation about our dream goals and our fantasies for what we really want for these families, with the balance of what's doable and then what sort of recommendations kind of fall in between. So there's like the bare minimum that seems very obvious, and then there are recommendations that we know might be a stretch for some states, but we think that the evidence is there to ask for it. In terms of how the strategies are worded, we also had conversations about will we ask the state to meet this strategy and put a program into place or recommendation into place, or do we ask the state to ask the hospitals, the pediatric treatment centers, to meet the strategy? And that was an important thing to distinguish. And that also, those conversations, I think, were guided by the expertise of those who have worked in the hospitals and families' experiences, and trying to understand where is the best location for a certain service to be delivered. I wanted to make some notes here. If you are interested in doing this type of work and reaching out to Mike, but aren't sure where to begin, particularly as it pertains to psychosocial issues, and which are very important. I'm biased as a psychologist, but also because I have to say that the majority of our recommendations to the New York State do have a psychosocial component, because of course they do. Cancer is a psychosocial issue. I think that I would just want to remind you that there are pediatric psychologists like myself with expertise in oncology who are embedded in oncology programs that that we can access and ask for support in this. If you do this work with Mike, I can help you find someone that might be able to contribute the time. I can say from my personal experience that this was not a huge lift. There was some logistical considerations in scheduling meetings, but this was certainly something that was doable in addition to my regular work. I would also encourage you to think about what the science says. What does the science say is the type of care that should be delivered to families affected by pediatric cancer, and where within your state are there gaps in that recommendation, in that evidence base, and the type of care that is delivered. And those are the places that I think are useful to hone in on as you're making these decisions about what to recommend. I also want to note the psychosocial standards of care, which I hope that many of you are familiar with. I just pulled up the page here. If you go to Maddie Miracle Foundation, you can read all of the psychosocial standards of care for children with cancer and their families. These were published in a 2015 special issue of Pediatric Blood and Cancer, and you can read them all yourself. And the reason I note that is because I'm not even sure if that's, I'm sorry, I don't know for sure if that's shared when I click the link, but you can read all of them there, and it gives you a place to begin as you think about what subject areas you want to focus on. There's also an available matrix and guidelines for the standards of care that treatment centers can use to evaluate how they're doing and meeting that standard. References to these were put in the New York State Cancer Plan. Among the psychosocial standards of care, I've bulleted here for you. This may be a small font for some of you, but you can zoom in or reference the website that I mentioned to read them in more detail. Here is just a place to start with a list of ideas that you might consider when you want to ask yourself, how is the state doing? How are families receiving treatment in all of these areas within our state? Are these things that we think that we should focus on? Given my background and my work, I focus very much on mental health, especially for caregivers. I am actually a co-author on the psychosocial standard of care for parents of children with cancer. I also do a lot of work now in palliative care advocacy, and I know that this is a huge issue in the state of New York, and was able to bring recommendations for both pediatric treatment centers and community-based palliative care programs in our state. But really, it's not about what's important to me. This is about what's important to you. So everyone who listens to this webinar today or the recording after the fact, you are a stakeholder in this. Stakeholders include clinicians, caregivers, survivors, children on treatment, the people that care for them. Everyone who is watching this webinar is a stakeholder because they have some interest in this and are ready to do the work. And I will end there and am available to respond to questions.
And we'll just finish up with talking about what are PBTF's next steps. So we are moving into additional states. Our team we've already started working on working with representatives from both Georgia and California. In Georgia, we've already engaged with their palliative care working group. As many of you know, Atlanta has been our home since our founding. So we are incredibly excited to join the efforts there and start helping so many of our neighbors that we've served for a very long time, and work with some of the institutions that we've been working for a very long time in the family support area. Now we get to work with them in the advocacy area. In California, we've connected with the drafting body there. We've also connected with another group that has started started to put together a pediatric cancer working group. They have done an incredible job. It's a group that includes both national and local nonprofits. So we are going to come in and add to that group in any way that we can. Historically, PBTF has been in California and involved with families there for a long time. So I know that we have some very motivated and wonderful advocates and activists that in California, and some of whom I'm sure are on this call. So we're very excited to start that work in California later this year. Ultimately, our goal is to move into more states as the year moves on, and that includes North Carolina, where I know some of our staff and a lot of our volunteers and families are scattered throughout North Carolina. So we're excited to start that process there and work alongside some of our partners. And then if we're not in your state, there's still really an opportunity to engage with our team, because we're going to be looking to recruit experts from across the pediatric cancer landscape that can bring their voices and their experiences and help us set baseline recommendations that we can offer to these groups, so that they can use them as they craft their state-specific recommendations. So let's move to the last slide, just to show you how you can get involved. So if you are not already signed up to be an advocate, you can go to our website at curethekids.org/advocate, or you can reach out to me personally at mhenry@curethekids.org, and we can set up a time to talk and talk through the different ways that you can start engaging with this specific initiative, or work with us on the federal level, working with legislators there. And feel free to reach out. I'm available to you, and can be flexible to meet with you. So with that, I would like to move into our Q&A session. If you have any questions, I would ask you to use the Q&A chat to start submitting them. We did get some questions from folks beforehand, and like I referenced earlier, I know that some of those questions were answered through our presentation, but I would like to single out that there are so many different topics and things that people feel passionately about, which again were reflected in the working group that we established in New York. So I see so many of these issues were addressed there, and we really came up, I think, with some really wonderful recommendations that were comprehensive. I saw one here. I saw a question here about some concerns over, is there duplicative efforts amongst organizations that are working on similar initiatives. Thankfully, there's been a lot of cooperation and really this enthusiasm to collaborate with the other organizations that are interested in this work. So I've already had calls with some of the national organizations that are working on this throughout the country. And we've committed to working with one another to help ensure that we're putting together groups that are working together and speaking really from the same place when they're dealing with these consortiums. I know that in California, I mentioned that they've already started this work there. We are going to be joining their work. And helping to bring, I know that they've been looking for some survivor voices from that community. And if you are in California, you have that experience, I would love to hear from you. And I would love for you to join up with this group and offer your voice. But I think New York is another great example of how we collaborate with these other groups, because we had organizations like Solving Kids Cancer, Children's Cancer Cause that came to the table. Those are both national organizations. We had local organizations like, more locally focused in New York, the Ty Lewis Campbell Foundation. We had Making Headway, the Making Headway Foundation involved in our group. So these organizations, we're all striving for the same goal, right? We're striving to ease the burden of these families, and so there's enthusiasm to work together, and people really want to ensure that we're collaborative. And maybe Chrissy, you could speak to that as well. What you observed in our New York group.
Yeah, I think this was very collaborative, and what's wonderful about having a representative from other organizations is that they have all of the insight into what the community that they serve needs and wants, because they've had many conversations with them. And so I think that the collaboration is important to have diverse representation in a number of ways. And actually, what was also useful about that is the experiences either of patient families or clinicians um, we have different experiences based on the treatment institution some of the time. And so by having diverse representation in that way, it was really useful to understand what other people are doing or what they have experienced as we think about where to set the bar for a state level recommendation.
I saw one of the live questions come in. Thank you, Kim. Will there be a representative from each state that will be responsible for engaging with other state committees so that there can be little to no reinventing the wheel? So I think this is really part of when we talk about creating these baseline standards, as we start working with these groups, just like we did in New York, and talking to these experts, I really do think we're going to come up with recommendations that address these universal issues that families face throughout the country. So the goal of that effort to come up with those baseline standards is to make sure that we're not going through this process over and over and over again, because of the great work that the New York group has done and what our family support team and our advocacy team will come up with alongside these leading experts throughout the country. The next working groups will have a much easier time when they sit down. They'll have examples of what we've already come up with, and hopefully those are just guideposts for them as they continue to craft these recommendations. I also saw in one of the submitted questions a question about how do we get state funding from every state to help fund research for childhood brain cancer. So that's part of these recommendations. Some of the recommendations that we've seen throughout the country they've led to the establishment of programs or state funded or state funds that have been allocated towards cancer research within the state, whether that's within academic institutions within the state. So Kentucky is a great example of that. They've established a pediatric cancer fund that the people down there have recognized that brain cancer was a huge problem. Pediatric brain cancer was a huge problem within their state. So they have made sure to allocate funds for researchers at both the University of Kentucky and the University of Louisville. And we've seen wonderful work done by the researchers down there. So yes, we can set goals, and we did set goals in New York for additional funding that the state can provide and additional investments that the state can provide for the researchers in their state. I'd like to. I know that this was talked about a lot in some of the submitted questions, so I'd like to ask Chrissy to address this, maybe specifically some of the educational needs and the individual plans that need to be formulated for these long-term survivors. That was a huge part of our recommendations to the state in New York. So Chrissy, if you could just talk a little bit about that and how they came up with those recommendations.
Yeah, so this really is a huge topic. And so we broke this down a little bit. You think about a trajectory of a child and their education and their educational needs. We often think of that as starting as in kindergarten, but really the bigger scope is also the developmental needs for children that are, from infancy to the age of 5. So we looked at the lifespan of education. We looked at stage of treatment, right? It's superimposed over that. And then we tried to think about how you would address the developmental / educational need for a child affected by cancer at all of these points on the trajectory. So, for example, we made recommendations regarding educational needs while on treatment. So, for example, many children with cancer who are on active treatment receive home instruction. In New York State, the standard is that they receive 5 hours a week. Other states, those numbers are higher. We were able to reference that. So that's a very concrete example of something that we referenced. Also, we know that children with cancer cannot always benefit from home instruction because they're often sick or unavailable for home instruction services. So we made recommendations for increased flexibility about how that education is delivered. Maybe some of it is done remotely. Maybe there could be some quote unquote makeup time for that education at other time points, like the summer for perhaps. So we tried to get creative and thinking about what we think might actually be feasible, and making those recommendations while children are on treatment. We made recommendations based on return to school, what schools need to know about educating a child who is being treated for cancer. And by the way, return to school could mean post-treatment completion, or it could mean while receiving active treatment and having to miss a week out of every 3 weeks of school for chemo, but can attend the other 2 weeks. So this is where it gets complicated, because should they be, if you sign someone up for home instruction, but they can go to school 2 or 3 weeks a month, we would like them to be in school if that's in line with the family's values and what's best for that child. So again, we talked a lot about creativity, and we talked a lot about learning needs and identifying those needs through neuropsychological evaluation. In our recommendations, I think we were very thoughtful about who we think should be providing services, on who should be evaluating the child, who should serve as a liaison and advocate for the child as they and the family navigate special education if those services are needed. And so we made recommendations that we felt were specific to what sort of programming we think should be embedded within hospitals who are well equipped with the expertise on educational needs specific to children treated for cancer, and then a focus on recommendations that we think should and could be provided by the educational system. So that's a lot, but we tried to think about all of these iterations to do the best we can in making recommendations that we think will meet a child's needs at different parts of their journey, depending on their stage of development. Did I miss anything?
I also,
Yeah.
no, I think that covers it. I think one of the other things that I see pop up a lot in these questions that were submitted is, how do we get these facilities, these children's hospitals, to collaborate and communicate better? And I think that was a big concern for our group in New York. One of the things that we asked the health department to do was intervene and try to force these institutions, or try to help better educate these institutions about the importance of collaborating and communicating with one another, especially when we're talking about pediatric cancers. So you're often going to have folks that are traveling long distances to seek treatment, and that's why it's really important that regionally they're communicating with one another, and we're not missing something, when someone travels from one end of the state to another. They should be all communicating and collaborating. And there was a huge part of the recommendations that we put forth. I also saw some concern about how do we ask doctors or providers and clinicians to educate themselves about the early signs of a pediatric cancer, and specifically the pediatric brain cancers that we're seeing. One of the solutions that our group came up with was, and we actually have seen this in other states in their plans, is offering continuing education opportunities that are specific to pediatric cancers, and informing not just other oncologists, but pediatricians, local pediatricians, about some of these specific types of pediatric cancers, what can be indicators of those pediatric cancers and how to catch them earlier, because we all know that the earlier that a child is diagnosed, the better it is for their survivorship odds. And in rural areas throughout the United States, that's a really big issue. It's a hard thing to tackle when you don't have the type of care that might be afforded to you, where you're closer to a big city and there's a COG facility, a children's oncology group facility. So it was a big concern for our group, and something that certainly I think the recommendations addressed.
And I'll just add that I think the educational piece was a recommendation we made in a few areas. That does not seem like a big lift to me, that the state would offer educational opportunities to oncology clinicians of other subspecialties who may see these children either prior to cancer or certainly after on the unique needs and their additional care. Also education to educators and administrators on what the needs of these families are. So I think we tried to put education in various places to expose the needs, I think, and more clearly of children affected by cancer.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we look at is within this group, trying to ensure that those clinician voices were heard. So it was really important for us to have those clinicians involved in this process because, for us as parents that have gone through this, or folks that work with hospital staff, we have very certain experiences with those clinicians and medical care team, but we don't truly know what their day-to-day is, or the struggles or limitations that are placed upon them. So hearing directly from them how the state could better serve them within the hospital, I think really benefited all of us. And I think it was a great learning experience for those of us that have experienced a pediatric cancer diagnosis from the patient family side only. And Chrissy, I'm sure you can speak to that. I thought the clinicians brought a wonderful voice to our group.
I think the collaboration is critical, because on the flip side, the parent caregivers did the same for the clinician group, that in the case that a parent would identify a need or a concern, and when we could say, hey, that already happens, or that is set up that way, then we could have a conversation about, well, so then what's the gap there that we're hearing from parents, such and such issue. There is actually potentially a solution or a match or some service that we can think of that should be provided. And so what's the trickle down? Like, why is that not happening? Where's the gap in that transaction? So the collaboration really was nice, because then you're able to narrow down what the real concern is and make a recommendation that's stronger because you're speaking to the real issue.
Yeah, and I think another aspect is for the entire group, it's a great way of understanding whether our asks are reasonable. So, patient families will have recommendations that, in practice would not be very practical. And we could get that feedback in real time from those clinicians who could say, well, it would be very hard to implement that because of X, Y, and Z, and vice versa with anything that the clinicians might propose. We had patient families that could step up and say, in terms of fitting into our bandwidth and our timeline, what we have to deal on the day-to-day, this might not work for us and might not work for the typical patient family that's going through this. Another big focus that we've seen is on easing the financial burden of these families. I think one particular aspect that is unique to these plans that gives us a great opportunity to interact with the state is focusing in on the Medicaid system within the state, and how the Department of Health can help interact with the Medicaid system to ensure that those that are within the Medicaid system in the state are better covered, and there's a wider swath of coverage for those families that are relying on the state insurance, either as a secondary insurance or as their primary insurance. And our group in New York identified a lot of ways in which their Medicaid system fell short. And it was backed up by the clinicians in the room who see their own struggles with the system at the hospital level. So it's just one aspect that we saw and we've addressed in our recommendations. I saw just a question here from Kate about continuing education for social workers. Another thing that we all focused on was trying to get those resources in front of social workers, asking the Department of Health to help educate those social workers and ensure that those social workers understood what programs were offered to families. A lot of the times we're just seeing that there's just simply not enough awareness around the specific programs that could benefit families, and all of us understand that there's a huge issue with turnover in hospitals with social worker staff, understandably so. But that also means that the training for these staff members is constant, and it would really help, I think, if these health departments stepped up and made sure that the information was easy to access for these social workers.
And for families. So we did ask for some resource repositories to be developed, and not just developed, but also updated, which is critically important. But I think this is a great state level recommendation, because a lot of resources that are available to families are state specific, maybe they're local nonprofits, for example. And so I think having state level resource lists that are accessible by clinicians and families is a great recommendation to put in.
We're coming close to time here, but I wanted to address Dawn's question because I think it's perfect for our New York group. Dawn asked what was learned and found to be needed in New York's planning relative to survivors who head off to college with the stumbling blocks that FERPA creates and the lack of academic campus understanding of survivor needs. So we were lucky enough to have a big group of survivors that are college students, including Jacob, who Chrissy worked alongside. Jacob is a student at Harvard Medical School, and all of them talked about the need for planning that transition, not only on the academic level, but also on the medical level, transition to adulthood, and that transition from high school to college is a large part of that. So in some of the educational recommendations we addressed, and some that we will be crafting, I think there's room to ask these colleges and universities, higher ed institutions to better understand how they can serve survivors, and come up with these individualized plans that we've been talking about. How can we extend those plans into college and higher ed? And Chrissy, maybe you can speak to that. I know that you had some experience with these.
Yeah, I'll say that I think that if I think about like what are the pathways to getting there, if the ultimate goal is that a college would understand the needs of youth treated for cancer, especially, in particular, like when they were treated at a much younger age, maybe they've been off treatment for many, many years. I think that the better job we do, whether that's we as providers, hospital centers, the state level educational systems do in the younger years at helping parents know what to ask for, know how to advocate, fostering that information over time in a developmentally appropriate way to youth themselves, they will be better prepared to then go to their own college and inform them of their history and show that they've had a series of educational supports, for example. So I hope that some of the recommendations that we made for support pre-college helps facilitate a natural flow for youth as they transition and become more independent. And I'll also say that with our group of survivors, as Mike mentioned, the few that were in college, they did not raise that as a significant issue, though I know it is the case for some. What they did raise were mental health needs at that age. And so that was a huge focus of the needs for that age group.
I hope that answered your question, Dawn. If not, reach out to me. I did want to acknowledge before we go, Ann Raymer was supposed to join us, but she had a family emergency. And so please keep her and her family in your thoughts as we move forward. But we appreciate the guidance that Ann has provided me through this process, and she will continue to guide many of us as an example of what they've done in Ohio. I think with no other questions, I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Mike and Dr. Salley, so much for your experience and expertise sharing with us today. We are so honored to have this topic talked about and to have you support our families as we continue working together to provide and do this critical work in the advocacy space. We will have a link to the recording of today's presentation. We will also send out the slides for future reference. And really here at PBTF, we welcome, as Mike said earlier, you to reach out to us. We want you to know that we're here for you along the entirety of your journey. And we want you to know that we're able to support you in that. So please reach out if you have any questions or if there's anything more that we can do to help you. Our contact information is up on the slide. And again, thank you so much, Mike and Dr. Salley, for this great conversation today. And we hope that you have a great day. Take care.